welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. For many of us, Radio Free Europe is the title of an REM song. But in fact, Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty were a critical part of the U.S. effort to counter the Soviet Union during the Cold War. In this week's episode of Horns, we hear from Mark Pomar, who was director of the Soviet Broadcast Division of Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, as well as a member of the Broadcast Board of Governors during the Reagan administration all the way through into the early 2000s. Pomar discusses his new book, Cold War Radio, which details his period with the Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty organization and talks about its successes as well as the trials and tribulations it experienced both within and without the U.S. administrations. Pomar also discusses with the host the applicability of these sorts of techniques to contemporary conflicts, such as the one going on in Ukraine, or potentially even the U.S. competition with China. In an era when information has become its own unique type of power, Pomar's insights are fascinating. Let's listen in.
Started a really interesting conversation with Mark Pomar, who from 82 to 93 worked as an assistant director of the Russian service at Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty in Munich, as a director to the USSR division at Voice of America and executive of the board of the International Broadcasting. Distinguished career. It is a little time to list all the accomplishment that the person and author of this fantastic new book. I would recommend people to actually read it carefully, to list them all. But I think that today is a significant day, not only because we have distinguished publishing, but this morning, Mark, as we all know, there is a martial law declared in occupied Ukraine. And the topic, political warfare of disinformation, is more important than ever. So this conversation, I would like to start in this context of the war and the invasion of Ukraine. So my first question would be, how does the study of the Cold War that you have examined in the book and shown us fine details that might not be known by the auditoria, help us to understand today's war?
Well, thank you, Kiril, and thank you, Will, for inviting me. It's great fun to be here to talk about a book and also talk about really an important period. And I think, Kiril, it's great to start with the war in Ukraine because so many of the grievances that Putin has put forward go right back to the Cold War, the end of the Cold War, the way the Soviet Union fell apart. But I would illustrate sort of the connection through a story. I mean, this is 1982, I joined Radio Liberty. And at that time, the Reagan administration had nominated or put in place a new management, different from the one in the Carter years. And many of the new managers, George Bailey, who was my boss, the director of Radio Liberty, and James Buckley, who was the president of RFERL at my time, really emphasized the importance of nationalism, religion, that Russians were victims of communism, that this was sort of a theme that the Reagan administration appointees very much advocated. So I remember going down to the canteen in the basement of the RFERL building in Munich and seeing a group of broadcasters and guests that were at the radio. So I sat down to have lunch with them, and I started, talking about this approach to nationalism and religion and Russia and so forth. And I can see on their faces that I'm not getting to them at all. As a matter of fact, finally, one of them, sort of grizzled dissidents, former refuseniks, people who had suffered through the Soviet Union. And finally, one of them said, "You dumb Americans, don't you understand that communism is dying, but nationalism is growing? And nationalism in the Soviet Union combined with Soviet practice, this is what's going to hit you. This is what you're going to find terrible." In 1982, they pretty much described what we see today in terms of Putin, in terms of his approach to Ukraine. One other story about the radios, just to put in context that the roots of that go really back pretty deep into recent Soviet history and certainly into the end of the Cold War. Fast forward from 1982 to 1991. We are in Moscow. It's still the Soviet Union, about 4 months before the putsch. So it must have been spring of 1991. I'm there with a group of people from Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, negotiating the expansion of Radio Liberty's reach within Russia. Frequencies, access to AM radio, access to FM radio. And in the course of our discussion, we're getting everything that we're asking for. And it's rather peculiar in the Soviet Union to get what you're asking for. There's something strange about it, but we were pretty happy. You want this frequency, you want that frequency. So toward the end of the day, this one guy called me over and said, look, let's go down and have a cup of coffee. So we go downstairs in this building. He turns to me, face full of anger, and he says, look, you've got to understand, you Americans, you've got to understand that right now we are weak. We have to agree to all these things that you're doing. We'll give you the frequencies, but when we get strong and when we get off our knees, we're going to kick you bastards out of here, and you won't know what the hell happened to you. 1991, the anger, the frustration, it was palpable, even in those, quote, magic years of 1991, that this was something that was not going to go down. And of course, in direct contrast to what was happening in Central Europe, where we were feted by Valenza, we were feted by Havel, where we were
Victory lap.
pretty much embraced as heroes. This was a very, very different situation. And I think this is a topic for a long conversation, but I think a lot of us in the West misread the sort of end of the Soviet Union, the sort of the end of the Cold War. I would argue in a different book, in a different context, that we may be in abeyance. They sort of put it off for a while. They were too weak to continue it. But that is something that's very much embedded. So I think the Ukraine war is so important for so many reasons, but I think to understand why that is happening, you've got to go back to that history of the late Soviet period, the end of the Cold War, and the grievances that come out of that period, the frustration, grievances, anger. That guy just as well could have been Vladimir Putin telling me. I'm sure he was a KGB person who was telling me that. But he said, you Americans just have to understand that.
That is very interesting, in some sense prophetic. There was a big conversation, right, going in professional circles in academia, how to perceive Putin, whether he is, relaying cryptic messages or we should read them at face value. And I think this is quite informative. But since you mentioned the radio frequencies, I would like to have to put this question to your attention. And the question is, how were the radios perceived in the Soviet Union?
Well, it depends on who in the Soviet Union you're talking about, of course. There was a cottage industry of attacking the radios that started right in 1953. And pretty much, and I describe in one of the chapters in the book how it slowly came to an end by 1988. And by 1989, positive articles started appearing. The thing to keep in mind, that the programming didn't change that much, but the perceptions very much changed. In some ways, the radios were kind of, if you wish, a barometer of change within the Soviet Union. As things got bad, we got attacked more and more in nasty ways. And, I should say that there was a bombing in headquarters of RFERL in 1981, about 9-10 months before I joined. There was, by services of Eastern Europe, probably security services, bombed part of the building. And there were, of course, individual attacks. In the 1950s, some of the RFERL broadcasters were killed. So there was a certain amount of, obviously, attack. But I could illustrate, maybe in a more humorous way, the perception that the radios had. In 1982, when I joined VOA in Washington, in 1983, I joined VOA in Washington, one of President Carter's advisors, and I wish I could remember his name, but I can't, Reagan had just called the Soviet Union an evil empire. There was this feeling among some people in Washington that we've got to bring together American specialists on the Soviet Union with Soviets to talk about things so there's going to be understanding. And so some rather wealthy person in Old Town Alexandria had a dinner for young, in quotes, American experts on the Soviet Union and Soviet representatives from the embassy. And so the director of VOA asked me, do you want to go to this dinner? I said, well, it's a free dinner, why not? I'll see what happens. So I go to this home in Old Town, And of course, I have a name, my name, and it says Voice of America. The Soviets come in, they see that, and everybody avoids me. They just walk as far away as they possibly can. Nobody wants to be next to me. Nobody wants to talk to me. And God forbid that anybody photograph them standing next to somebody from the Voice of America. So I kind of walked around the dinner, had a little bit, and I left. Fast forward to 1987. 1987, I'm at the Board for International Broadcasting, which is the federal agency that oversees Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. We're there at the invitation of Ambassador Jack Matlock to begin the first negotiations for the cessation of jamming. And this is something very important to note, that Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, BBC, and VOA were heavily jammed throughout the period until the late 1980s. The West never jammed Soviet broadcasts. You could listen to Radio Moscow all you want. You could buy Soviet newspapers and books in their store in downtown New York City. It was obviously an asymmetrical situation. Anyway, we were there because if you accept glasnost, and by the way, the word glasnost appears in the early documents of Radio Liberty. I was going through the documents and looking at 1950s, and there was that word glasnost right there. As the goal of the radios was to have glasnost, was to have open conversation, was to have open debate. So we would say, and of course, President Reagan at every meeting with Gorbachev would say, "Why are you jamming? This is meaningless. You're contradicting the very." So we went there. Ambassador Matlock had an agenda for a set of meetings for 7 days. I would point out, and I mentioned this in the book, that for security reasons, the embassy thought it would not be safe for us to stay in a hotel. So we stayed on the embassy grounds. That was the security decision at the embassy, that this was just not a safe place to be. And we had diplomatic visas, so it was kind of easy to go in and out of the country. And we go to the first meeting, and Ivan Ivanich was called away. We go to the next meeting, the guy is sick. We go to the third meeting, didn't come in that day. And we realized that nobody in Moscow in 1987 wants to meet with two representatives of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. It's just too dangerous. They didn't know what to say. So it's best to be sick. And so we spent the week, we walked around the city, it was great fun. We left. 1 year later, so this is 1988, you can see glasnost gaining sort of strength. It's becoming more policy, more accepted. We go as part of a large USIA delegation. We're there with many people in different USIA exchanges, academic work, cultural, and we're part of that. And then, of course, Mr. Fallon, who was the head of it, meets with us, and the first words he says is, "We have noticed an improvement in the programming." And once he said those words, we realized something big had happened, something changed, something different was taking place. We'd never heard those words ever in the course of the entire Soviet period. 1988. And indeed, now he complained after that, said that we were spending too much time on Afghanistan, that we were spending too much time talking about social media. I mean, he had his complaints, but those words were extremely important. 2 months later, jamming ceases. 4 months later, Radio Liberty has an office in Moscow. VOA has an office in Moscow, hiring broadcasters, hiring freelancers all over the country. It is a change dramatic from 1987 to 1988. And of course, that changes the whole ballgame as that takes place. Very important to note, because in 1991, when the putsch takes place, and those 3 important days when the Gorbachev is under house arrest in the South, and when the group in the Politburo wants to take over, every Soviet media is closed except for RFERL, BBC, VOA, that are broadcasting freely because they're not jammed. They're broadcasting from outside. There's no way you can stop them. And finally, just to top off how these things change, and I described this in 1993. So we're now, quite a bit already into the post-Soviet period. The 40th anniversary of Radio Liberty takes place in Moscow at the House of Writers. All the democratic elite come, including Mr. Gorbachev, who comes and praises the work that we did. So the former general secretary of a country that spent its entire history attacking RFERL comes in Moscow in 1993. I happened to be his interpreter that evening. We spent a very nice hour or so chatting. A bunch of American sort of right-wingers like Forbes and Wattenberg and Michael Novak sitting with Gorbachev, and we're sitting there having a pleasant hour chat about the wonderful work that the radios had done over the period. So that just illustrates that the work was important, the work was critical, and the Soviet Union changed as it went. I will add as a coda that the office that we opened in 1988 was closed finally in February 2022. So that office existed until February of this year, and it is gone, closed, period. We're back to pre-1988.
I think that the use of this really interesting metaphor of the barometer that really caught my attention would lead me to the next question. For our audience and for those that will read the book, we want to have a little spoiler. So I want you to discuss a little bit the major themes of the book, as it contains so much interesting details.
Well, one thing I would say about the book, if any of you have to reread a paragraph, I have failed. My goal was to write a book that nobody would ever have to reread a paragraph. So it's got to be easy enough to, and I edited it with that in mind, so that it should be something that would be, let me just say why I wrote the book. Maybe that's kind of a way of, I principally wrote the book. First of all, when you hit 70 years of age and you're living in a nice place like Texas, and you can sort of do whatever you want, you kind of look over your life and sort of say, what was interesting, important, significant in your life? And I realized that all of us, most of us in this room, have lived through one of the quintessentially important moments in world history. I mean, I don't think we can even comprehend what it's like to go from a Soviet Union to whatever the post-Soviet world is. It is so profoundly, deeply different in so many ways. And I wanted to at least offer that sliver of what I had the privilege of both having a front row seat and also being a participant in. And I was very lucky to be old enough to be in the room, young enough to outlive many people who were in that room who no longer could do that. So I wanted to communicate what it was like to be a Cold Warrior. What was it like to be in the Cold War on a day-to-day basis, the feel of it, the sense of it. Because remember, something like the radios, we participated in every single day. It wasn't something that we waited for the Soviets to attack us. We were engaged in it in a way that was minute by minute every day. So I wanted to communicate that. The other reason, really major reason, was that I wanted to, we spend so much time in the United States criticizing ourselves. This went wrong, that went wrong. Iraq was a problem, Vietnam War was a problem. I wanted to sort of sit back and say, look, there were things that worked. There were things that worked very well. They worked on a bipartisan nature. Mm-hmm. They were not mired in domestic political issues. I will tell you quite honestly, when I was in the late 80s, when I was at the Board of International Broadcasting, and Steve Forbes, who was the chair of the board, he and I would go at Capitol Hill, and we would meet with congressional representatives, with senators. It did not matter, if you can believe it, it did not matter whether they were Democrats or Republicans. There were outliers. There were people on the very fringes that were not interested. But the vast majority of Congress fully understood, supported, was engaged in what we were doing. And I think that's something that's also, from administration to administration, from Truman to Bush Sr., there was solid support. There was one president who probably showed the least amount of support. And it's always a question I would throw out, but some of you will probably know the answer. Who do you think was the least supportive? Nixon had a people read my book, as a matter of fact, I found in the archives a declassified, top secret declassified, where Kissinger writes to Nixon that your idea of closing Radio Liberty, may not be bad if we can get a good quid pro quo for that. Right there, documented, no. And who were the most supportive? There were really everyone was support. Truman was brilliant in terms of setting that up, and I have great respect for Truman, having gone over some of the documents and read some of the materials. But the two most supportive were Kennedy and Reagan. Kennedy came to the VOA, I mean, his short term of 3 years. Kennedy had dinners for RFERL. He was interviewed by, their pictures, they're wonderful photographs of Kennedy with an RFERL microphone giving an interview. Reagan came twice. I was there actually on a Saturday when he came to VOA and spent time with us. So those were probably the two most enthusiastic, but everyone supported the radios. And I think that I wanted to communicate, because I think there's a sense in today's US that somehow we're always mired in horrible political turmoil. That was not the case during the Cold War, at least not in the areas that I was involved. And the third reason may strike you as kind of very different, and that is that the radios, especially Radio Liberty, is a repository of independent, in the case of Russia, Russian culture, in the case of Polish, in the Polish service, that the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe as well at that time ceded public debate because of the censorship. Mm-hmm. You could not debate ideas of what took place and what were the different political views, what was political culture, what were writers. The radios were that. The radios were the repository of independent, all kinds of views. In the case of the Russian, we had from sort of fringe monarchists to socialists, Mensheviks looking for some kind of new Leninist democracy that they could find. So we had the whole span. Most of them were in the middle and they were rather normal people, but we had quite a span.
Still on the fringe.
Fringe. And I used to tell people that, I studied Russian history at Columbia, had a PhD, so I knew a lot of the ideas of Slavophiles and Westerners and so forth. I get to the radios and these people are living it. They're not just talking about it. They personify those movements. They are representative of them. And you have to know, in a matter of a few, you have to know the shorthand of political debate. Russian internal emigre Soviet debate. And of course, we had different emigrations, which I also described. So you have the first emigration with their biases, prejudices, views. You have the second emigration after World War II. And then you have principally the Jewish emigration in the 70s that have their views and their perceptions. And all of that in one cauldron. Everyone's arguing. Everyone's going over the daily run-up as to what
extremely vibrant.
So it was an immersion in Russian political culture, the likes of which no university and no place else could possibly give you.
Well, thank you. Now I'm going to do, what I would like always to do in talks like this and be a little bit provocative. So I'll go with the hard questions. For scholars like myself and my colleagues that are interested in political warfare and disinformation, I would be interested to hear what role did the radios played in the so-called political warfare in the Cold War, as there seemed to be a lot of misunderstanding and speculation as well on that topic.
We very naively believed, that factual information had real power. That we really honestly thought that broadcasting, the Gulag Archipelago, Solzhenitsyn's account of the Gulag, is going to have a profound effect on the country. It was the nature of the times that truth would win out. There's that by broadcasting what we thought was, solid, for example, Soviet history, the repressions of the Stalin period, would help Soviet citizens understand the nature of their regime. And what they did with it was their business. We never told them what to do, but we wanted to give them enough factual information that was available to everybody in the West, denied to them purposefully, so they could at least function as relatively informed citizens. That was sort of our idea behind it. It sounds a little bit kind of idealistic in today's world, post-truth world and whatever else we have, but we really thought truth mattered. And so I think, now when you talk about disinformation, when I was at the Voice of America, I sort of had a seat at what was USIA called a disinformation analysis office at USIA. I didn't go to every meeting, but I very frequently went primarily because it was very important for us at VOA to know what the Soviets were peddling as a disinformation campaign worldwide. So, for example, the AIDS, the very famous AIDS, that was invented by the U.S. I remember discussing it with people at USIA who followed it very, very closely. We decided our tack to that was, we're not going to talk about Soviet disinformation, but what we will do is in our medical program, we had a weekly medical program. We'd spend a lot of time on the medical program inviting doctors, specialists, researchers to talk about what is this disease? What is happening with it? How are people coping with it? In other words, basically giving them the same information that any educated American could have, and bringing in experts. Very much, I'm skipping a little bit to the Chernobyl, but Chernobyl in my time, I was head of the Russian service during the Chernobyl crisis. That was one of our tense periods where we spent most of our programming getting experts on nuclear disasters, on medicine, on what to do, and very, very carefully making sure, because we were the voice coming in, and there was virtually total silence, obviously, on the Soviet side. So we didn't obviously deal with it. And I make a point in the book, and I think this is very important, that whatever information the Voice of America broadcast was two-source information that any Westerner would have. There was nothing that we broadcast that nobody else in the world would know, or there was some kind of secret, materials that was given to us. And that's and then there's some work done on the Cuban Missile Crisis, for example, where the Voice of America, this is well before my time, obviously, where the Voice of America was very careful not to broadcast anything from the government side that was not already in the New York Times or Washington Post or AP or UPI. Very, very concerned that it not be a conduit of information that is one source from the government. So it's a very important point at the Voice, and one that's protected very carefully.
I think that those remarks, and specifically when you talk about engagement, with the other side, especially when in peddling disinformation, is actually critical in terms of perception in closed and open societies. And as you say, naively, but I think we can learn a lot in our post-world truth today from the lessons of the success of those radios. So would you be so kind to tell us what you consider are the lessons that today platforms such as radio and other digital platforms can learn from the experience that is described in the book?
Well, I would begin by saying that life is a lot harder now than it was for us. It was much, much easier, I think, in the 1980s for a number of reasons. One, I already mentioned, there was this generally accepted belief that facts mattered. But I think beyond that, communism was dying. People in the Soviet Union, I had a Fulbright fellowship in the Soviet Union in 1981, so a year before I joined the radios. And in my 6 months there, I never met a single person that had anything other than total disgust for the Politburo and for the Soviet system and so forth. Tremendous interest in the West, and eagerness to learn and eagerness to find out. We were, in other words, riding a wave that was very receptive to what we were doing. There was the human rights movement, the dissident movement, the Jewish emigration refused movement. These are movements within the country that were very open and sought out the West. We are now facing an opposite. We're now facing a situation where there is resistance to, distrust of, kind of a hatred toward the West. And so you're going against the wind rather than with the wind. We were fortunate to sort of be either riding a wave or going with the wind, whatever metaphor you want to use, where things were easier for us. Now it's much harder. I will say, though, and this is a plug for today's VOA and RFERL, which I think is superb. I'm a frequent guest on the Russian side of both stations. They now do television mostly. I don't think VOA does radio. They do TV. Radio Liberty still does a little bit of radio. They do a lot of TV. I think this coverage of Ukraine is spectacularly good. I mean, I start my day by going there rather than any other source for a number of reasons. One, they have about 100 freelancers all over Ukraine reporting from every town, village, anything happening. They're interviewing the mayor, they're interviewing the local officials. And it's, of course, all in Russian. Ukrainians, by the way, speak beautiful Russian everywhere, and they're more than happy to give interviews in Russian. There's also Ukrainian service, which is very good. I just don't know Ukrainian well enough to listen to it. But so they're doing a very, very important job. Now, whether they are reaching, that's where the resistance is going to come. Now, obviously, they're reaching the people who are fleeing. The people who are fleeing Russia are clearly fleeing because they're seeing what's going on. So you can rest assured they're fleeing not because they're watching Russian television, because they're seeing other sources. And there's no other outside source in Russian anywhere near the level of RFERL and VOA. And they combine forces to create something called Current Time. Current Time is the combined VOA, RL news sort of service that draws in from both stations. So they have a separate and then they have a combined one. I would venture nobody has that, anywhere near that, what we are having. And in its surprise that Congress actually allocated more money for the radios this year so they could hire a lot of the Russian journalists who fled when Echo of Moscow was closed, when TV Rain was closed. They are now mostly in the Baltics, or they're in Prague, and of course RFERL is in Prague. By the way, just something to realize, that is a gift of Havel to the American people. That in thanking the U.S. for the work of RFERL, Havel presented a building in downtown Prague for free on behalf of the U.S. as a gift. That's just something Americans don't think of. It's just something that people don't know and don't realize that we are and have been beloved in the world and respected for what we did right. So that is something where, but I can't answer as to how it's going. It's going to reach some people, obviously, in Russia, and then you can see by the 200,000+ who fled that it's reaching a sizable. But whether it's going to penetrate beyond that is something I couldn't possibly tell.
Well, thank you for this, and I'm enthusiastic, and I would like to thank you actually for your enthusiastic support on the radio waves, but also here at our campus, for all of the efforts we are making to reach, to explain, to present alternative view as well of what is going on, because frankly, one could argue that we are in the midst of a reiteration of this political warfare that we're talking about, and information is key in disinformation.
Just to come back to today's RFERL and VOA, they are very careful when they do a story. They also give the sort of Russian official view. So you see Putin giving a speech, or you see, they don't, it's not, they try to give a comprehensive. So when they covered and I watched the Putin speech on the annexation, 2 weeks ago or so, they did it just like any American TV station would do, where they gave the full speech. And then they had 2 or 3 people commenting on what's new, what's not new, is there something there, in a very open, kind of relaxed way. So I think they don't see themselves as an alternative, they see themselves as a comprehensive presentation. So you're getting the war party's views. They don't avoid that. They give a little clip of what the war party, the people in Russia who are advocating even harsher measures against Ukraine, and other points of view. And I think that is something that is very, very important. So someone watching is not just being skewed one way. And you never see what the other side is doing. They'll give the other side, its basic due without maybe going overboard. I will tell you, since we're sitting at the LBJ school, I should tell you a story about previous director of the LBJ, who also happened to be, I'm skipping a little bit, but if you don't mind, it's an LBJ story, so I think people should hear it. John Gronowski was the director of the LBJ school in the 70s. He was also the chair of the Board for International Broadcasting. Gronowski had this idea, which is scorned by the radios, that the Soviet Union should have its say if it disagreed with a program on radio liberty. So if Radio Liberty broadcasts on the Gulag and the trials of 1937 or whatever, the Soviet Union should have its reply. It caused, I mean, not only did it was just horrific in terms of the concept that the Soviet citizen is getting the Soviet point of view day in, day out, exclusively. The last thing we need to do at Radio Liberty is to give the Soviet Union yet one more platform and legitimize their point of view. But that was the view of the director of the LBJ school in the 1970s. One, I should say that when the Carter administration ended, he got immediately removed in 1980. But just that concept was very much debated. And I do talk in the book about the purists versus the strategists. And I think if you're going to look at the radios, that's sort of central to what we did. We had the purists, especially at VOA, but we did it at Radio Liberty, who really, most of them coming out of American or European schools of journalism. We've got to be just 100%. And that's where this whole Gronowski idea of giving the Soviets their equal time and so forth. And then there were the strategists who said, look, this is an instrument. We know what the Soviet Union is broadcasting. We know what our listeners are hearing. We're going to give them information. We're not going to repeat what they say. Or at least we'll repeat it only in the context that makes sense. We're not going to give them a platform and say, here, come on. But that's a bigger issue for any of the broadcasters, American, whether it's CNN, whether it's others. You have to make those choices. And we grappled with those choices a lot. And a lot of arguments around the table. And there were people who really stood their ground saying, no, this is the way it should be. And others contended that no, the strategy part. And very often it was someplace in the middle. I say that nobody was a pure strategist, nobody was a pure purist, but people grappled with those ideas. It was a very serious, I guess what I wanted to communicate in the book, it was a hyper serious radio station. I mean, it was almost too serious for at times. There wasn't enough fun and so on. It was just like getting at the
which is balanced, I believe, also as you demonstrate in the book with culture and arts, which is, I think, also a very important component. What I'm glad is that you have mentioned this, because I specifically, when I was reading the book, I've highlighted the specific section about the balance between, and I quote, strategic narrative and purist journalistic functions of the station. So, of course, my question would have been, but you addressed it partially, is what are the tricks in keeping that balance? And what was the role of the, I would not say less serious, but not politicized content?
Well, any news organization, if it wants to keep listeners, has to have some balance. You can't just, be serious 100% of the time. You're going to lose listeners. You've got to have something. And from the very beginning, music was one. I mean, and partly because the Soviet Union banned jazz, banned pop music. So the radios played all the Beatles, the radios played all the popular, music of the time. And VOA, there was a director of the Russian service called Terry Catherman back in the 70s. And his idea was actually quite revolutionary. He said, look, why are Russians talking about America? We should be hiring Americans to talk about the United States in Russian. And so the VOA did something in the 1970s that had never happened at all. And they started hiring Americans who had learned Russian in college or in school and college, had traveled to the Soviet Union, had gone to Middlebury and other summer schools to perfect their Russian. They spoke with an accent, but they spoke very well. They spoke fluently, but they were real. They were authentic. They could talk about not just the United States, but they could talk about music, which was very popular. As a matter of fact, we probably got the greatest number of letters from the Soviet Union about our music programs. Because when you talk to Soviets of a certain age, that's the first thing they talk about, is they learned, whether it was Simon and Garfunkel, Johnny Cash, the Beatles, whatever it was. That's how they knew it, because it certainly wasn't broadcast radio ever. That was all decadent, Western, horrible. And curiously, in the articles that I read criticizing the VOA, the number one criticism of the VOA is you are enticing our youth away from true socialism. That was the first and biggest criticism of VOA, was its appeal to, the youth. And of course the youth, and of course we also did film, we also did the latest fashions, all the stuff. Why did people buy jeans on the street? Because they heard about it. I mean, it's just, that was the way in which they learned about them.
Fascinating that you mentioned this, because in my mind, I was immediately equating today, when we look at the material, the content of post-Soviet, currently Russian, criticism against the liberal West. One of the themes, that we, for instance, monitor in the lab is the spiritual assault. And it's an evergreen. It seems to me that at that time they were saying you're enticing the youth. Now we have politicians in the Duma, as you know very well, which basically are repeating this age-old theme about corruption, and not only physical but spiritual. And this is a fascinating topic to me, because under this bracket, if you will, we're looking most likely next week, we're looking at the new package of legislation which completely will ban all the propaganda, as it's called in Russian, homosexual propaganda. So that will be a new wave of repressing, human rights, I think. But it contains something that you had to deal with professionally.
I should say that, of course, the first criticism was youth. The second reason we were criticized will come as a surprise to most of you, was for religion. So religion was the second reason why VOA and RFERL was deeply criticized in the Soviet press. And probably the one chapter in my book, and I write about human rights, culture, arts, Solzhenitsyn, but probably the one chapter that is totally new to anyone who's ever studied the radios is the chapter on religion. Because I would say no one really knows much about it. And yet, from the very first day of Radio Liberty in 1953, the very first day or soon thereafter of VOA in Russian, religion played a role. Now, it played a strategic role. I would say that's the strategic broadcasting, because that was something that the Soviet Union denied. And it was also a way to reach maybe audiences that were not the typical Moscow, St. Petersburg, or Leningrad back then, urban, more sophisticated. Elite. We wanted to reach people, in different walks of life. So the Voice of America and Radio Liberty had a separate Orthodox program and a separate Judaism program. And the Judaism program played an incredibly important role in the 1970s with the whole Refusnik movement, where Jews were applying for emigration to Israel and then were denied, and then end up in no man's land, and so on and so forth. So those programs, and I went back, I knew them from the time I was there, but I went back and listened to them again as I was doing research. And they really stand up very well in terms of time. I think they would be broadcast today. They would be some of the most talented writers contributed to them. And so you've got voices from the 1970s and 1980s, who were very major figures on one hand in the Orthodox world, on the other hand in the Jewish world, who were regular participants to these programs. And I think their programs could very well be listened to now, and they would certainly find. So that was another area that strategically we sort of saw
strategic
as
messaging.
Now it's sort of strange to equate that with Western decadence, but in the Soviet context, that was something that was a threat to the regime. It was a direct threat to the regime.
Paradoxical, but
and it was very much supported. And I would say actually in the 1980s, it was growing in a big part of and I try to at least capture some of that in the book. There's much, much more. One could write a whole book on that, just on that topic alone. I think that would be just the extent to which that was important. So I think we tried to choose topics and themes, again, that would make sense in terms of what the Soviet listener was not getting and what we could provide. But at the very core, the idea was that we were simply communicating what in the Western world would be considered perfectly normal. Normal discourse here, we tried to share it with listeners. It wasn't that we were trying to teach them. It wasn't that we were trying to tell them what to do. And that was, by the way, a very important point. And post-1956, Hungary, there was a very careful, where the Radio Free Europe was accused, I don't know how, I'd never studied it in great detail, but was accused of having given directions to the insurgents in Hungary in 1956. There was a very careful, there was a fair amount of kind of editorial principles that the radios adhere to. And one of them is you don't tell people in your listening audience what to do. You just don't. You can share, you can talk, but you never tell them, do this, do that, you should be doing this. And that was very much seriously adhered to. I would say that.
Which leads me to, before I'm going to ask, some interesting, questions, or more on a lighter note, I suppose, about interesting anecdotes that did not make the cut in the book. But before that, I'll ask one serious question and more challenging, I suppose. I'm very interested in your personal opinion. When you look back, in hindsight, what are the major foreign policy mistakes that could have been avoided in the post-Cold War period in dealing with Russia? The benefit of the hindsight.
That's like a whole separate topic that's outside my book, which I'd be happy to talk about since I dealt with it. I would begin, just to throw out some ideas on top of my head, I would say the biggest mistake we made, and I saw this in the U.S. government time and again, and just for background, I worked at IREX, which was a large international exchange organization. So we ran a lot of USAID, State Department, USIA, and other programs. So we had a lot of government programs that we ran on behalf of the government, not as government employees. I would say the equation of Russia with every other country was the biggest mistake. I remember having dinner in Moscow with the director of USAID in Russia. And he was enthusiastically telling me about this wonderful program that they had done in some African country where they translated a lot of textbooks into the local language and how they were distributing them for free and how wonderful that was. And I'm saying, you are absolutely wrong. You do not understand the first thing about Russia. They will never, ever, ever accept a textbook in school produced by a foreign entity. Ever. I mean, there's like total and absolute non-understanding that Russia is defining itself as a great empire. It's just an interesting point. The U.S. wanted to have, and very wisely, have Peace Corps missions throughout former Soviet Union. There's one country that hated it. Only one, and that's Russia. And they threw them out. Because it's an insult. In Russian mind, it's an insult to have a Peace Corps program in their country. And if you don't understand that, you don't understand the first thing about Russia. It's a completely different beast, a completely different animal. It's thriving in Ukraine to this day. I mean, it's just, Ukraine is different, Russia's different. And I think that is something that people just do not understand. There are plenty of mistakes. I think we did not understand and did not realize that the movement that supports today's war in Ukraine started the day the Soviet Union fell apart. That did not start in 2005 or 2010. It started right there. And the documents and the, if you want, the roots of the war party were right there in the 1990s. Now, they were maybe not as prominent. Maybe they were not as vocal. Two very stories that don't come into my book, but I think illustrate that. In 1996, I was head of the IREX office, and I was in Moscow, because we had a large office. We had AID programs, State Department programs. I had 40 people in Russia working. And the director of the IREX office in Moscow said, it'd be great if you went on Russian radio, Echo of Moscow, and talked about our programs, drum up interest. Maybe more people will apply. We were getting hundreds of applicants anyway, but, drum up business. And so Echo of Moscow, the first independent radio station in Russia, still started before the end of the Soviet period, invited me for a talk show in the evening. So I would talk about what the U.S. was doing, what kinds of programs we were offering. And we were offering graduate programs, undergraduate programs, high school programs, professional. We were spending millions and millions and millions of dollars basically educating the next generation of Russian leaders. And doing so, very generously. And so I'm describing this, and then the calls start coming in. And the calls are full of hatred. You get the hell out of our country. You damn Americans, we don't want you. To the point where the person who was running the program got so concerned that he basically turned off let's forget these calls coming in. This is horrible, because they would go on air, and it was the most, it was terrible.
1990 in Austin?
1996. That pouring out of just visceral hatred to the West and the US. And we sort of all kind of said, well, it must be peripheral, it's not that important, you know how it is, these people haven't gotten over it. It was there, and it just simply kept growing. I could fast forward 2007, the 200th anniversary of US-Russian diplomatic relations. The Russian side sponsored it in Russia. And they invited me as president of IREX. They've actually paid for my ticket to come and to be present to it. The main speaker was Henry Kissinger, so I got to sit next to Henry Kissinger, much like I'm sitting next to you. And it was a grand event in Moscow to celebrate the 200th anniversary. And I had to get up and say a few words. So I said something about the early exchanges and how Alexander Yakovlev came on the first exchange back in 1957 and so forth. There's a nice reception afterwards, and these two guys come up to me, and they're practically ready to punch me out. So, you turned Yakovlev into an American agent. You guys destroyed the Soviet Union. They were literally the two angry guys, and they were ready to get into a fist fight. 2007 at a reception in Moscow.
Which is it's just incredible.
And if you read in the sort of what used to be called the yellow press in Russia, now it's the main press. If you start reading that beginning in 1992, you will see everything leading to what we have today in terms of Ukraine, in terms of Russian grievances, in terms of so on. So there's nothing new what in terms of what Putin is saying. Now, whether we thought it would lead to an all-out war, probably most of us did not. I certainly did not think it was. I thought it would stay at that rhetorical, angry interference, hybrid war, whatever.
But no kinetic action.
But not that. I mean, that sort of went way beyond. But that background, the lay of the land was there. That is not some weird thing that Putin dreamt up in 2022.
Just out of curiosity, it just provoked me to ask this. That's not something that I prepared, but. What is the most outlandish conspiracy theory, that you have heard during your tenure about the radios and yourself?
About myself, I don't know. We were always accused of being sort of the mastermind CIA operatives who were going to bring down the Soviet Union. I wish we were a quarter as smart as they assumed us to be. I mean, they thought we could do everything, which of course
omnipotent.
I think they ascribed to us a greater significance and danger than we thought we posed. We thought we were pretty, we didn't call for the end of the Soviet Union. We just wanted people to be freer and to talk and to be able to do things the way they want. They thought we were these great masterminds who were going to bring down the Soviet Union and so forth. So I think they attributed, I was speaking at Fletcher School just on Monday, and one of the people in the audience, and she's at Harvard, came and she said that she's from Kazakhstan. This is apropos of what you're saying. And she told me it was so interesting to listen to it because my father was the head of the security services in Kazakhstan, and his job was to listen to the radio stations and to know the significance of what RFERL and VOA said in terms of American policy. That is how important they thought. Whereas all we were doing was broadcasting what was in the general news. I mean, there was nothing we were broadcasting that had anything beyond what anybody else. But she said her father's job was to make sure that they recorded everything. And in the book, I do mention very briefly that when the archives opened in the early 1990s, Russian scholars started looking at a lot of the materials about the books. And one thing they found was that beginning in 1953, the KGB had a special office that did radio monitoring. And they would monitor reports of the most important points that BBC, VOA, RFERL did. And it would be sent to a select number of officials within the Soviet government. So they would always be informed day by day what the radios were saying on important issues, foreign policy issues, domestic policy issues, what they were saying, who they were quoting. And the mark was that if you were very important, you got the full. If you were less important, you got a censored version. And if you fell out of favor, you stopped getting that report. So the report was a indication of your place within the Soviet bureaucracy, how detailed a report you would get about what the radios. So they attributed to us so much significance that I think left most of us kind of speechless, because we really were quite a modest operation of people trying to do their best. But I don't think that anything we did was that profoundly deep and significant, but they attributed because it's a conspiratorial society. And the other point to keep in mind, and I think this is very important for today's war, is that totalitarian states, dictatorships, desperately need free information, and they don't get it within their own system. So there's no feedback to anything, whereas the radios at least provided some kind of feedback to the leadership, so they would at least have some sense of what was being said and done that their own press would never report. There's a point I quote Mr. Yakovlev coming back. No, this is Yakovlev, who's really the mastermind of glasnost and perestroika and so forth, in which he's interviewed I believe in Prague, so this would be late 80s, and he's asked about the Soviet media, Russian media that's changed. He says, yes, Russian media is improving, but if I really need to understand what's going on, I turn to Radio Liberty, because it's just simply a much better source than he would get from his own media.
So Mark, this is so fascinating. How did you, in your role as both someone concerned with the substance and with the organization, how did you assess your audience? How did you know what was working, what was not, what was reaching people, what was not? And then how did you, once you did that, follow-up question, how did you then talk about it to your masters at home?
Well, there was an office in Paris that RFERL funded that was a little bit separate from the radios, and it was called Soviet Audience and Opinion Research. Soviet Audience and Opinion Research, run by a very nice guy, Gene Parda, who's just published a book. Speaking of book publishing, his book is out, Central University Press, on exactly that whole mechanism of how they did it. And what they did was a combination of factors. They had, first of all, once the emigration, specifically primarily to Israel, went, there were focus groups done a lot in Israel and in Rome, where they were sort of transferring from country to country. Now that gave a certain picture, didn't give detail, because it's a bit skewed to urban, educated, your demographic is, but taking into account, it gave some sense of feedback. There was also a way of interviewing Soviet citizens who would come on various conferences. There was some traffic going back and forth, and wherever possible, you would try to engage them in a conversation, not on the radios, but on things that would be related to the radios that would give you a sense of. So you never ask them whether you listen to Radio Liberty, but you would engage them on topics that Radio Liberty had covered to see whether or not how they would engage on it. It was done sociology. There was an office at MIT that really provided kind of the mechanisms and ways of interviewing people in closed societies. And there's a famous, it's a very interesting name, Desala Pool, something very famous MIT sociologist. His name, it's in the book, I just don't recall exactly, who set up a way of dealing with how do you interview people in closed societies? And so the radios did it on behalf of VOA, on behalf of BBC, so they weren't partial, they weren't trying to sort of promote. So we used that information, explaining to anybody that it wasn't. But the point our masters understood that this was important, even if we were not getting that kind of feedback. What did matter, and we did use, were the cost of jamming, which was more expensive than broadcasting. So if a country spends so much money on jamming, obviously it is having some kind of effect. Otherwise, why jam? And go ahead. And of course, in the articles of tax, and so forth. The embassy also in the different countries had its network of contacts in the country. So they would be able to give us what's called the country reports. I don't think they were particularly scientific. I don't think they were particularly deep, but they offered additional kind of information. And really, the proof came out only when everything collapsed and we were able to do focus groups in country and so forth.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much.
Quick follow-up to that, if I may. You
Yes.
mentioned letters earlier.
Yeah.
By what path would a Soviet citizen write to you?
Accommodation addresses. So the radios had a whole set of what's called, and were called accommodation addresses.
Now you do sound like a CIA.
Now you're talking our language.
That's the way it was set up in the 50s. And so there were all these ways in which you could send letters. Now, when I was at VOA, every so often I would get what you could call the Komsomol letter. The Komsomol letter was, I would get a letter from some irate, usually a woman in some factory in some godforsaken city, who would be outraged that I would put such traitors on the air like Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Aren't you embarrassed and ashamed of yourself? These would be this kind of, obviously somebody wrote it for her, or whoever didn't exist. And I would get letters like that, kind of indignant Soviet citizen over how dare you broadcast whatever we happen to broadcast. But that was obviously sort of nonsense, and we took it as that. But no, the audience, Jeremy, was a question that we grappled with a lot.
Sure.
But the emigration, and occasional defectors, but the emigration helped us because we had people who were sociologists. They were coming from the Academy of Sciences who had other surveys they could at least share with us in terms of.
But it sounds like in the end you were making impressionistic judgments.
Oh,
Nothing wrong with
absolutely.
it, but
Absolutely. Although they bore out pretty well based on the future. And what we didn't know, and there are available now, is that the KGB was doing its own survey of listenership. And those actually gave higher numbers than we ever thought. So one can look at the KGB ones. They were available in the 90s for a while.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.